Good evening, everybody. Hi, welcome. My name is Amara. I am the programming librarian for New Canaan Library. So welcome to this evening's program. Gil Harel presents Wagner's Ring Cycle, the second of 3 lectures of Valkyries and Heroes. In the second of the Ring operas, okay, can you say this part?
Die Valkyrie.
Yeah. Yes.
An umlaut there. Umlaut.
Wagner introduces controversial narrative themes including incest, adultery, and the rise of a hero on the order of Nietzsche's, and another umlaut.
Übermensch.
As the story develops and the cast of characters grows, the composer keeps the listener simultaneously grounded and enchanted through the use of leitmotifs, short musical cells or fragments that are associated with a character or idea. In doing this, he establishes a musical phenomenon of paramount importance that we see represented in scores ranging from Star Wars to the Harry Potter films. So tonight's presenter, as many of you know, is Gil Harel. Gil, yeah? So Gil is a musicologist and music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from classical repertoire to jazz and popular music, as well as opera, medieval, and Renaissance music. Previously, he has served on the faculty at CUNY Baruch College, where he was awarded the prestigious Presidential Excellence Award for Distinguished Teaching, as well as the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics at Chengdu, China. Currently, he teaches at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he was recently presented with the coveted Merit Award for exemplary service to the college. At NVCC, Dr. Harel conducts the college chorale, teaches music history and theory, and serves as the musical director of theater productions. Outside of teaching, he has joined Staying Active as a pianist and vocalist. So as a reminder, please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Gil.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Amara. Great to see you back, healthy and hale as an ox. Great to see the... She was unwell last week. Thank you for being here, folks, once again. It's great to see the room packed to capacity. One would think that perhaps at least some would have been scared off by the scope of what we're endeavoring to study this week and the next. However, I can see that you are an intrepid bunch, and you're ready to once again take the plunge into Valhalla and learn more about Wagner's Ring Cycle. Now, last week we had a very immersive program. Blue bottle. Thank you, Sandy. Last week, during our first program, we had a chance to dive into Wagner's biography. We talked about his involvement in politics and philosophy. We talked about the exile from Germany after the failed anarchist socialist uprising against the Elector of Saxony in 1849. We talked about Wagner and his peripatetic lifestyle, the sojourning in Switzerland, which led him to cross paths with one of many who would become his benefactors. In this case, it was a man, Otto Wesendonck, who hosted Wagner, and it was during that time in Switzerland that Wagner got the idea to write an epic opera on the topic of the death of Siegfried, Siegfried being a hero that we have yet to meet, but we'll meet him today. However, Wagner decided that the scope of this project would need to exceed one single, puny, paltry opera, and in fact he would need 3 grand operas to tell the story, plus a prelude opera of sorts. The prelude opera we discussed last week would become, of course, Das Rheingold, the Rheingold, which is short by Wagnerian standards, clocking in at just under 3 hours. It practically goes by in the blink of an eye. That will not be the case for the operas we discussed today. When we look at Die Valkyrie, the Valkyries, and certainly at Siegfried, which will begin today, we're talking about operas that are well in excess of 4 hours, and when you factor in intermissions, are often over 5 hours. So this is not like going to hear Donizetti's Elixir of Love. This is an opera that's going to attract a certain type of opera goer, and we call these people ring nuts. That's not just me being glib, by the way. That actually is an established term, and it has, in fact, been incorporated into the lexicon of musicologists and music writers. Why do we call them ring nuts? Because, well, what we find, and we spoke about this briefly last week, is that devotees of Wagner's Ring will often pay huge sums of money and travel enormous distances for tickets to see and hear the Ring Cycle, sometimes even for standing room tickets. I met someone in the Boston area who, in fact, traveled to Seattle because tickets had come on eBay, and he was off flying the next day for standing room tickets to the Ring. Well, a testament to the occasional fanaticism that one encounters when dealing with Wagnerites. As George Bernard Shaw would famously coin the term, the perfect Wagnerite. And devotees of Wagner have all sorts of names, but I like ring nuts because it's wonderfully colorful. And speaking of colorful, we're going to start today with the god's entry into Valhalla, which is marked by the rainbow, which is conjured up by Donner and Fro, Wotan's lieutenants, and they are gods of, well, in Donner's case, the word Donner actually means thunder, so he's the god of thunder, the weather, I guess. And Donner and Fro is the tenor, Donner is a baritone, and Fro literally in German means happy. So two gods who serve Wotan, one's named Thunder, the other is named Happy. They sound like puppies, don't they? Donner and Fro. Well, at any rate, the god's entry into Valhalla is very important 3 minutes or so of music. Here's where Wagner, I used the expression last week, raises the stakes. He introduces the idea that the ring has serious power, that the curse that Albrecht places on the ring in scene 1 of Rheingold has serious power, and there will be consequences to the actions of the characters in Das Rheingold. Now, Rheingold features many characters, but they all have one thing in common, which is that they're mythological or supernatural characters. That is to say, Wotan, well, he may just look like a guy with a beard and an eye patch, but Wotan is the head of the Norse pantheon. Wotan is, in fact, the German rendering of Odin, which will be more familiar, especially to you Marvel fans. Loge, the god of fire and trickery, duplicity, is the tenor, and he is another one of the gods in the pantheon here. Donner and Fro, we mentioned. Fricka is the wife of Wotan, and she is sort of the goddess of marriage and family values. We'll see that come up in an important way in Act 2 of the Valkyries. Freya, the goddess of youth and beauty, who gives the gods their golden apples to keep them eternally youthful, is the sister-in-law of Wotan, handed over to the giants Fasolt and Fafnir as security against the loan of sorts that's essentially Wotan owes them for building Valhalla. And of course we have the characters who begin the opera, the Rhine Maidens, and Albrecht, the dwarf, the sinister character who initially comes across the gold after attempting to, shall we say, cavort with the Rhine Maidens in a rather salacious way, I should add. Albrecht has, well, he's no saint. He wants to get physical with these Rhine Maidens in a lustful sort of way. And when they tease him mercilessly and reject him, that is what causes him to renounce love and embrace the power of the ring, of the gold, I should say, which he fashions into a ring. So dwarves, Rhine Maidens, who are sort of mermaid-type characters who dwell at the bottom of the Rhine, gods, giants. Well, Das Rheingold has something that we see across all the characters, and I mentioned earlier, they're all mythological characters. There are no humans or humanoids in the story yet. The gods are going to play a lesser role in the second opera, and certainly in the subsequent operas, an even more diminished role. Those of you who know the fourth opera in German is Die Götterdämmerung, or in English rendered as Twilight of the Gods. In the original staging, and in most traditional stagings, the whole operatic tetralogy, the cycle of 4 operas, ends with the inferno that is the burning of Valhalla. So that's where the story is headed, but how we get there is very interesting. Now, this particular program is called Valkyries and Heroes. We're going to talk about how Wagner introduces the race of the Welsung, the humans, into the story, and why that raises the stakes now that we're going to be not focusing on, well, Alberich and Mime and Fasolt and Fafner and Wotan and Fricke and Donner and Frohe and the rest of the gang from Das Rheingold. We'll end today's program by introducing the early scenes from Act 1 of the 3rd opera, and that's Siegfried. Next week, we will wrap up by starting at the end of Siegfried and then talking about the marathon opera that is Die Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, which has perhaps the most depressing marriage scene of any opera ever. We'll listen to it next week. Before we listen, I want to review a few ideas that we talked about in last week's lecture. Recall that we discussed Wagner's approach to writing operatic music as being, to some degree, shaped by his antipathy towards and criticism of Italian opera. For Wagner, Italian opera lacked several essential ingredients. Number one, the acting was ancillary. Music had primacy. The vocals especially had primacy. The orchestra was essentially functioning as what has been described as a giant acoustic guitar, merely strumming chords to support the singers, while they more or less stood around on stage and didn't do all that much, or at least that's what Wagner says. So in Die Kunst und Revolution und Die Kunstwerk der Zukunft, the artwork of the future, Wagner lays out his ideology, his thoughts on how opera should exist, how compelling opera should be created. He goes about this by, well, controlling a lot of the elements himself. So he's going to be intimately involved not just in writing the music, but he's also going to write his own libretti. That is to say, the script or the words that the characters are singing, the poetry, if you will. And he's going to have a hand in other elements as well, including staging and costumes and even the design of the theater itself, which we'll talk about at a later time, either today or next week, the Bayreuth Festspielhaus in Bavaria. We call this principle of unifying all of these theatrical elements the Gesamtkunstwerk. Remember that one from last week? Gesamtkunstwerk is a single German word comprised of 3 individual words. Gesamt meaning total or complete, Kunst meaning art, and Werk meaning, well, work. So, Gesamtkunstwerk, the total or complete work of art. An opera should incorporate all of the various dramatic elements, Gesundheit, and not just have characters singing on stage and rolling their eyes at each other as they more or less remain stationary. Wagner was adamant about that. He was especially enchanted with the notion of ancient Greek drama. Not that he could have known much about it, but he liked the idea of how it was described by the classicists as involving great pageantry, elaborate scenery, dancing, chanting, singing, and acting. And he's going to attempt to work that in. Now, before the program started, I had a chance to chat with a few people, one of whom said to me, I listened to Das Rheingold last week, and I found it a little bit frustrating in the sense that there were no clearly demarcated sections with melodies that one could simply hum as you walk away from the opera. And, well, I could see how that criticism might come up, although there are many themes and motifs which we're going to discuss. This is not what we call a traditional number opera. None of the Wagnerian operas are. Wagner was opposed to the idea of number opera. Now, why do we call it number opera? Because, well, if you were to look at the table of contents of a Mozart opera, or even a Donizetti opera, or a Bellini opera, or a Rossini opera, you would see that it would say number 1, overture, number 2, chorus, number 3, recitative, number 4, aria, number 5, recitative. Number 6, duet. And this gives operas for example, Mozart operas. A bit of a herky-jerky quality, doesn't it? And many people, well, let's face it, are not so enchanted by or smitten with the recitative movements, which are essentially dialogue movements sung in a kind of half-spoken, half-singing style. Wagner was opposed to this. He's going to coin the term unendliche Melodie, which literally means unending melody. And the idea is there should be no breaks, that the music should flow seamlessly. And we're going to see examples of that, especially if you were to watch longer stretches of these operas. You would find that you don't really get very obvious breaks sometimes. There is this flow from one movement to the next. And if you're used to Mozart opera or early Verdi operas, this is quite a bit different. All right, we're going to look now at the god's entry into Valhalla, which really marks the end of Das Rheingold. Now, this is subtitled, but I can't move the subtitles. So what I'm going to do instead is put it on theater mode, and you will see the subtitles somewhere around here, which should be nice and viewable for all, I hope. When we get to Valkyrie, I have been able to configure super titles, so we'll see them on the top of the screen, and then we can full screen it. So who are we going to hear in this scene as the gods are heading into Valhalla? Recall from last week that Valhalla is the gods' fortress up in the clouds that's been built by Fasolt and Fafnir, the giants who have this very, well, thumping leitmotif in the bass register. They're both singing in the low register. You can't expect giants to sing in the tenor register, can you? It doesn't really, no. They have to stomp around. And they've demanded repayment for building Valhalla. Remember, they're holding Wotan's sister-in-law until they're repaid. Now, unfortunately for Wotan, he can't do what perhaps many would like to do, which is just to hand over their in-laws as payment. Instead, because Freya is the goddess of youth, and because the gods need her golden apples to maintain their immortality, Wotan is forced to come up with a plan, and that plan is to head down to Nibelheim, where the dwarves live, and more specifically where Alberich holds dominion, to contrive to steal Alberich's treasure, and most importantly, to steal his ring and his Tarnhelm, and hand that over as payment to the giants. And he does. After the giants bicker over the ring, Fasolt is clubbed to death by his brother Fafnir, and Fafnir stalks off with all this treasure and the ring. We're not going to hear from Fafnir for another 6 hours of music. He's just going to sit in his forest cave on a pile of treasure. And as he says, Ich liege und besitz, I lay here and exist. So we won't meet up with him again for a while. Finally, the debt has been repaid and the gods are free to enter this fortress, and they're free to enter Valhalla. But there's a burr in the saddle, a roach in the rushes, a fly in the ointment, however you want to describe it. The music is going to be clouded here. We're going to hear the Rhine Maidens singing off, and they're going to be singing the Rheingold theme, which was sung at the end of scene 1. We're also going to hear the Valhalla theme, which we hear at the beginning of scene 2. So we have this sort of convergence of various musical leitmotifs. I should point out that Wagner himself did not use the term leitmotif. He used the term Grundthemen, which literally means foundational themes or something like that. A leitmotif essentially is a short fragment of melody, or occasionally rhythm, or harmony, or all of the above, that represents an idea or a character. Let me play some from the ring cycle. That's the Rheingold theme. And when the gold itself is invoked, where we have Valhalla, when you hear the gods are talking about Valhalla, you hear a theme that sounds like this. Something like that. When we hear Siegfried, opera, he has a hunting theme. And when he's off gallivanting around the forest like a true hero with his sword, we hear it over and over again. So there are dozens of these motifs. And in that way, it's not dissimilar from how a composer would use leitmotif. For example, how John Williams does it in Star Wars. Whenever we hear Darth Vader or see him or one of his Star Destroyers or Death Stars, what do we hear? Over and over again, right? When we see the main characters in Fellowship of the Ring, we hear. So composers after Wagner are going to really embrace this idea of leitmotifs, of fragments of melody that represent characters or ideas. And the examples I just played are just the tip of the iceberg. So, all right, we're listening for the convergence of various leitmotifs. We're listening for music that sounds at times regal and processional, but here clouded with doubt and with the uncertainty of the future. Now that the gold and the ring are in the possession of Fafner, the domino effect of Alberic's curse and the woe that it will betide many of the characters we're going to meet, including the gods themselves, who meet their end at the end of the fourth opera in the tetralogy, are going to be evident. So here is the gods entering Valhalla at the end of Rheingold. Very, very bombastic music, some would say, as Wagner is dialing up the size of the orchestra here, asking for doublings on a lot of brass instruments, which, well, brass instruments are already fairly loud. Stentorian is a nice euphemism for loud, by the way. If you ever meet a brass player, you can say, if you don't want to offend them by telling them they're being loud, you could say, you're being very stentorian right now. Well, in any case, Wagner, I mentioned last week, is going to be so dedicated to the idea of shaping the vocal, not vocal, but the instrumental timbre, vocal timbre as well, that he's going to order that a new brass instrument be built, and because he is such a selfless and, well, man devoid of all ego, he's going to call this instrument the Wagner tuba. The stakes are raised in the Valkyries because, you see, in Die Walküre, we have the introduction of human characters. Unfortunately for Wagner, when this opera was completed, and he really was, when he finished the Ring cycle, all four, as he was working on them, it was very important to him that they be presented as a tetralogy, in sequence, 4 consecutive nights. This was very important. Remember the Gesamtkunstwerk, the unification of all artistic vision. Well, unfortunately, his sponsor at this time was King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Now, I don't know, we talked much about him. I think I at least talked to you about his German nickname, Verrückter Ludwig, which means Crazy Ludwig, or as we called him last week, Lunatic Louis. Ludwig II was so excited. He was a very young guy when he took the crown, when he ascended to the crown. He was so excited at the idea of staging these operas that he countermanded Wagner's own decree, and in contravention of Wagner's wishes, he decided that the Valkyries would be presented as a standalone performance. Well, this irritated Wagner so much that Wagner himself boycotted the premiere. And he encouraged his friends to boycott the premiere as well. Franz Liszt, who had an on-again and off-again friendship with Wagner, attended and was said to have wept copiously because of the emotional impact of Valkyrie. And it does pack a punch, although today I think when people listen to it, especially people who are new to the music, when they come away from the third act, they will perhaps most saliently be affected by the recognition of the famous Ride of the Valkyries theme, which starts the third act. By the time we get to the end of the third act, where Loge, remember him, the god of fire, is summoned to place an enchanted fire around Brunhilde, we'll meet her in just a few moments. It is very poignant music, and it's going to very effectively set up the third opera, where we'll meet Siegfried, the one hero who knows no fear and is therefore the only person who is suited to freeing Brunhilde from her magical slumber. Let's start with a brief overview of Die Walküre, or the Valkyries. There are 3 acts here. In the first act, we come upon Sieglinde and her husband Hunding. Hunding is an interesting name. Hund, of course, in German means dog, and it's been suggested by some that the name Hunding is sort of, in German, calling someone a Hund can mean something on the order of a bastard, as opposed to, William the Conqueror, whose name was William the Bastard. That was a reference to his genealogy and not to his personality. Here it is a reference to the personality. So Hunding, we know from his name, is not a good guy. He's an abusive husband, and we're going to learn that he's been up to even more sinister things. And there's a ferocious storm raging outside, and a traveler arrives at Hunding and Sieglinde's home. And he's a tenor. His name is Siegmund. We don't know that yet, by the way. We're not going to find that out till about an hour in. So this mysterious tenor is singing, and he sings about his ill fate, how he has been out in the elements, and he has lost his family, and we'll learn more about his background, but essentially, to catch you up in a succinct way, what he discovers is that Sieglinde, the woman who's living in this house with her husband Hunding, was forced to marry Hunding against her will, and that Siegmund now finds himself essentially in the den of the enemy. Hunding is his mortal enemy, he discovers, and they are destined to fight to the death. But Hunding says, tonight, because you've asked for safe passage, I am obligated to grant you safe passage for the night. But tomorrow we'll fight to the death. Now Sieglinde is a crafty wife, maybe not a great wife to Hunding, but she decides that in order to better get to know this mysterious guest, she's going to drug her husband. So Hunding spends the second half of Act 1 in a drug-induced slumber. Meanwhile, Siegmund and Sieglinde talk, and this is, by the way, not a normal house. They've got a tree in the middle of the house. Yeah, it's a tree. It's a very special tree because the tree has a sword in it, buried up until the hilt, and nobody has been able to remove this sword. The prophecy says that only a hero who possesses true integrity and strength of a hero will be able to remove the sword. The sword, of course, should be said, is a symbol, and it represents masculinity and virility, and therefore we can say is a phallic symbol. That imagery will continue into the third opera, especially when Siegfried forges the sword, and it's sort of his coming of age, if you will, his bar mitzvah, I guess you might say. He's officially a man once he forges Notung, the sword. So Act 1 of Valkyries introduces us to these characters, and really there's just three of them, bless you. There's three characters. Hunding, who, as we said, has nap time halfway through the act, and then Siegmund and Sieglinde, who don't know initially but they're about to discover that they are in fact twin siblings, separated from each other at a young age. It takes them a moment to recognize each other. One has to suspend one's disbelief a little bit as we read this. And so Siegmund and Sieglinde, fall in love, and they consummate that love. And we get very evocative music in this climax of Act 1. Let's listen to a little bit of the famous Wintersturm scene. We have subtitles on the top, and for those who read Italian, we have locked-in Italian subtitles on the bottom. Having freed the literal sword from the sheath, he is now going to, well, I won't say any more. He, however, is going to, conceive a child that night with his twin sister, Sieglinde. Now, notice the word Sieg in the name, Siegmund, Sieglinde, Siegfried. Sieg, of course, as unfortunately we learn when we study the 20th century, is the German word for victory. This is another one of those things that we'll talk about next week, because it's important to make the distinction between Wagner, the German language, the Third Reich, and the cloud or stigma that hangs over the German language. I think when many of us see the word Sieg, we can't help but imagine that hideous phrase, Gil Harel, which was the greeting in Germany for over a decade, from 1933 to 45. So anyway, there you have a little bit of a German explanation here. He calls himself, Siegmund does, when he first arrives, he says, "My name is Woeful." And of course, Sieglinde, eventually recognizing him, names him as Siegmund, and he says, "Siegmund heiß ich und Siegmund bin ich." I am called Siegmund and I am Siegmund. Well, this seems like we could end after Act 1, have a nice happy ending. But of course we can't. So in Act 2, we meet the daughter of Wotan and the earth goddess Erda. Remember we talked about Erda last week, she who cautions the gods. She usually sings, about half of her torso is beneath the stage, and she pops out in many productions and sings. But she's the earth goddess, so you want her to descend from the sky? No way. She's got to come up through the stage, and she's the one who cautions Wotan at the end of Rheingold. She's the one who says, "Wotan, get rid of the ring. The ring is bad news." And we are going to meet her a couple more times. Actually, she's going to make appearances throughout. Sometimes she makes appearances and doesn't really do much. She just kind of pops out of the stage and tells Wotan that she has no advice for him. At any rate, we meet Brunhilde, and Brunhilde is a Valkyrie, one of the eponymous Valkyries. And the Valkyries are warrior maidens, and their job is to gather the fallen souls of battle and to take them to Valhalla for rest, where they can be reunited with the gods. So Brunhilde she's got interesting qualities, right? She's the daughter of Wotan and the earth goddess Erda. So she, in the mythology or lore of the Ring universe, she is sort of a divine figure. She's not a Welsung. She's not humanoid. And yet she's going to get very close with one of them, Siegfried specifically. Now, Wotan is watching over all of this, and he knows that, okay, well, Siegmund and Sieglinde have just had this very loving reunion, I guess you'd call it. Not a typical sibling reunion, but anyway, it is a reunion of sorts. However, his wife takes great exception to this, because remember, Fricka is the goddess of family values, so she points to Wotan, and Wotan loves that Siegmund has removed the sword from the tree. Wotan's the person who put it in the tree in the first place. So Siegmund is realizing his destiny, and Wotan loves this. So he wants Brunhilde to interfere and make sure that Siegmund kills Hunding in the battle. Well, Fricka interferes, and Fricka says he violated the laws of marriage because he basically, there's adultery involved, and they're brother and sister, so they've committed incest. And for that reason, Siegmund has to die in his duel with Hunding. Well, Wotan is very dejected when he doesn't want to argue with his wife, who's rather peckish and authoritative, it must be said. Fricka is very good at getting her way. And so Wotan has to tell Brunhilde that it is his decree that Siegmund die in the battle. But Brunhilde, witnessing the true love between Siegmund and Sieglinde, Brunhilde can't bear to see the death of Siegmund. And so she refuses to intervene on Hunding's side. Wotan sees this happen, and he shatters the sword. That's very important. The shattering of the sword is going to be an important plot as we head into Siegfried, the third opera. And the death of Siegmund will come to pass. He's going to be killed in his duel with Hunding. Hunding doesn't have much time to celebrate his victory because Wotan is so contemptuous that he winds up killing Hunding as well. So Hunding got to celebrate for a couple of minutes, and then he too joins Siegmund in death. Sieglinde, remember, is now pregnant, and she doesn't have a father to raise this child. Brunhilde is in deep, deep Scheisse. She's in, it's bad news for Brunhilde because she has defied Wotan. Remember Wotan, heeding Fricka's demand, decreed that Siegmund must die in the battle, and yet Brunhilde does nothing to see that Siegmund is killed. In fact, the opposite. She wants Siegmund to win the duel so that the true love that she sees blossoming between Siegmund and Sieglinde can continue to flower. So she's got to get punished. And we're going to just watch a short clip from Act 3 of Valkyries. Here's the famous ride of the Valkyries. And this is also from the same production we just watched. This is Daniel Barenboim at Bayreuth in 1991 or 92, I believe. 91, I think. It's every 6 years, so I think that's right. Yes, I don't know that I can control. So the famous music that many recognize from television commercials and the famous scene in Apocalypse Now is derived from the very first bars in Act 3 of the second opera in the Ring Cycle. One of the things I didn't play, which I think makes this so effective, is the way it starts with just these constant trills in the strings, sustained pedal tones in the upper register. So let's listen to a bit of that. We'll back up just so we can hear those first few bars. It's a very powerful way to begin an act. Very effective way to begin an act. Very unusual, very novel way to forego an overture or anything like that and jump right into the action with this very tense, very unstable music with those high trills. It should be said that this staging is a little bit unusual. If you're wondering why are the Valkyries wearing trench coats, leather trench coats, I'll say this. It may look weird, but this is nothing compared to some stagings of the Ring Cycle. There was a staging not too long ago, probably 5 years ago, done by Frank Kastorf, who was a stage director at a comedy theater in Berlin. And he may have intended to be serious, but his staging wound up being comedy to many because, well, he set all of Valkyrie is set on an oil field in Baku, Azerbaijan. Yeah, I'm still puzzling that one out. And in the third act, rather than Siegfried forging Nothung in a forest cave, Siegfried is in a trailer park with RVs around him, and there's a kind of a Mount Rushmore behind him, except instead of presidential figures, it's Mao and Pol Pot and Ho Chi Minh. So anyway, and the third act of Siegfried, instead of being set in an enchanted fire on the top of a mountain, is instead set in the Alexanderplatz in East Berlin with crocodiles. Go figure. You'll be glad to know, you're wondering, how does Frank Kostorff end this incredible staging of the Ring Cycle? Well, Brunhilde, instead of burning down Valhalla, is going to burn down the New York Stock Exchange. So maybe we'll look at some pictures of that staging next week. All right, I want to jump into Siegfried. We're going to end with Siegfried today. I'm going to watch it. This is one of my favorite productions. This was done also in the early 90s with James Levine conducting the Met and Siegfried Jerusalem here. Believe it or not, that is his real name. Siegfried Jerusalem wound up singing the role of, well, Siegfried. And who is Siegfried? Siegfried is the son of Siegmund and Sieglinde. And you see, Sieglinde didn't last very long. She gave birth to Siegfried and then perished not long after. So Siegfried has been raised in the forest, away from just about everything, very remote. And he's been raised, of all the people in this whole Ring universe to raise him, he's been raised by Alberic's brother. Remember we talked about him, Mime, the pathetic Nibelung, who he's a very skilled blacksmith, but he sings in this cartoonish tenor voice. Well, he lives in this cave, and don't think that he's vying for Father of the Year award or anything like that. He's raising Siegfried to his own end, and Siegfried is this strong, heroic character who sort of gallivants around the forest, and he is impervious to pain. He doesn't know what fear is. He tramples everything underfoot, and he does whatever he wants, and he sort of verbally abuses Mime. And it's sort of funny because Mime kind of plots on stage. We, of course, as the audience, hear everything he says, but for some reason, Siegfried, who's standing right next to him, can't. So, well, Mime is a very skilled metalsmith. In fact, he's so skilled that he's the one who forged the ring in the first place. He's the one who forged the Tarnhelm all the way back in the beginning of Das Rheingold. Well, not the beginning exact, in scene 3, so halfway through. However, despite being this incredibly skilled metalsmith, there's one thing he can't put back together, and that is Nothung, the famous sword that Siegmund was able to pull out of the tree. Nobody can break it since it's been shattered by Wotan. Wotan shatters it with his spear during the duel with Hunding, before contemptuously dispatching Hunding, as we said. So the shards of Nothung are in Mime's smithy. He has the shards, but no matter how hard he tries, every time he tries to forge it, he winds up breaking it on his anvil as he tests it. And so it falls to Siegfried himself to forge the sword. Now, I mentioned earlier, this scene is fraught with imagery. Imagery and symbolism, allegory. This is, what did we call it before? His bar mitzvah? This is his coming of age. This is Siegfried becoming a man. He's going to become a man. Now, is it a coincidence that he becomes a man by forging a sword? That same symbol we talked about from the second opera? No. It's a symbol of his manhood. And of course, what's he going to do with this sword? He's going to defeat Wotan. Wotan is going to try to block. First, he's going to go stop and make a pit stop in the forest and kill Fafnir the dragon. To be honest, Fafnir doesn't put up much of a fight. He just sort of sits there and exists and gets stabbed through the heart. The blood from Fafnir has magical properties. And when Siegfried licks the blood off his hand, all of a sudden he can hear the translation of what the wood birds in the forest, the wood bird is singing. And hearing the wood bird, he realizes that Mime is planning on poisoning him. The only reason Mime has raised Siegfried is so that Siegfried can kill Fafnir, Mime can poison Siegfried or find another way to get rid of him, and then take the treasure and the ring for himself. Mime's sole objective, by the way, is to return to Nibelheim so he can abuse the dwarves down there. He basically says as much in this scene. Well, after killing Fafnir, he goes back. Mime tries to offer him the poisoned drink, but Siegfried, seeing right through it, thanks to the enchanted blood from Fafnir, kills Mime, and now he's going to make his way up to learn the meaning of fear. This is what he wants to do. So he goes to the enchanted mountaintop where Brunhilde, remember the Valkyrie, has been in an enchanted slumber since the end of Valkyries. So she's been sleeping for at least 4 hours at this point. Now, Wotan is blocking his way. And they duel briefly, and Wotan is finally defeated. And this is a very landmark moment for Wotan, who's in disguise here, by the way. He's der Wanderer, or das Wanderer, actually. He wears his eye patch. Usually in most productions, he wears a hood or a hat or something as the Wanderer. Now, we'll talk more about Wotan next week because he's going to factor. He's one of the few characters who appears in Rheingold and also appears in Twilight of the Gods. So, Act 3 of Siegfried, the ending of Siegfried, the third opera, ends with Siegfried beholding Brunhilde and awakening her from her slumber. He has one of the strangest lines when he does it, by the way. I don't know if anybody has seen this scene, but he cuts the armor off, and the first thing he says is, "Das ist kein Mann," which means, "You're not a man." It's sort of a strange line, but of course she is clad as a Valkyrie in hauberk and breastplate and other medieval armaments. Here is Siegfried at the end of Act 1, forging Notung, and Siegfried Jerusalem is the singer here. I should point out that it takes a special kind of tenor to sing this role. It's one of the most demanding roles in the repertoire. Wagnerian tenor roles are hard in general, but because Wagner had enlarged the orchestra, and because he's calling for such stentorian instruments, a lot of brass, it requires a singer who can essentially belt above all those instruments. And this type of singer has a very special designation in the repertoire. We call this type of tenor a Helden tenor. Helden from the German word Held, meaning heroic. So this is not just any tenor to sing this. And Siegfried in this scene has to sing repeated high A's. Now, most of the time he's singing on nonsense syllables, but we'll hear this sort of steady rhythm in the background. Dum, da da dum, dum, dim, dum, dum, da da dum, dum, dim, dum, which is music that's going to evoke the Nibelheim theme. So we're really connecting the dots between the dwarves, Mime, and Siegfried in this scene. This is the end of Act 1 of Siegfried. An impressive performance by Siegfried Jerusalem here as he not only sings with aplomb but also plays percussion as well, all the while Mima is making omelets off on the side and fantasizing about how powerful he'll be once the ring is his. Well, Siegfried seems unstoppable and impervious at this point, and indeed, through all of the third opera, it's one victory after another for Siegfried. However, he will meet his demise in the fourth opera, and there's a lot to say about that. It's more than meets the eye, you might say. A lot of philosophical overtones in the fourth opera as Wagner weaves this massive tetralogy to a close. We're going to see the influences of various philosophers, I would say most saliently Feuerbach and Arthur Schopenhauer, so we'll talk about them next week. We'll also get to talk about the reception of the ring cycle, how it's been interpreted, and how it's been used in various settings and contexts by different people, and how Wagner himself has become intertwined. His legacy of all of his works, it is perhaps the ring cycle by which people will always measure Wagner and associate Wagner, for better or worse. So we'll talk about that as well. I know many of us are perhaps curious to hear about the appropriation of Wagner's music by the Third Reich. We will discuss that and address this point next week when we talk about an infamous descendant of Wagner's known as Winifred Wagner, who was, well, pretty cozy with the Fuhrer in the 1930s. So a lot to get to next week. We'll start with the end of Siegfried by looking at Act 3, after which we'll proceed to look at a few scenes from the marathon opera that closes the cycle, The Twilight of the Gods. We'll watch the last scene, the famous immolation scene, and then we'll talk about some of the issues regarding the legacy and impact of this work. So I look forward to doing so. Thank you so much. And I want to make one announcement before we leave. Tomorrow night, I will be starting a 4-part series at the Darien Library. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. I mean, it's a great idea. If I could clone myself, it'd be a better idea. But I will be at the Darien Library starting tomorrow and subsequent 3 Tuesdays after that for a 4-part series on music in the Enlightenment. So a much different type of music than what we've been studying here the last 2 Mondays. But we're going to learn all about the transition from the Baroque period into the classical period. We'll talk about early classical figures, including Haydn and Johann Christian Bach, a.k.a. Johnny Bach, a.k.a. London Bach. We'll talk about Mozart, of course, and by the end of it, we'll be talking about the anti- or counter-enlightenment, and that will bring us into the orbit of a man who's going to be celebrating his 250th birthday next year, and of course, that would be L. van Beethoven. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow night if you can make it, and if not, I will see you next week for more Wagner right here at the New Canaan Library, 6:30 p.m. next Monday. Thank you.